Juan García was the embodiment of the impossible, an anomaly in the stratified society of Jalisco in the 1990s. A black man of humble origins who, against all odds, built an empire in the technology and logistics sectors. His brilliant mind and tireless determination catapulted him to the pinnacle of success. He was not the heir to old fortunes. Every penny had been earned with sweat and an unshakable faith in meritocracy. He believed that the system, however flawed, could be conquered with intelligence and hard work. He was a philanthropist, a man who reinvested in his community, trying to pave a path for others that he had blazed alone. He was living proof that the dream was possible, but he little knew the nightmare was about to begin. It's for stories like his that I continue to share these accounts, and if you can subscribe to help us hit our goal of 1,000 subscribers and comment where you're watching from, you help me bring more impactful narratives just like this one. Far from the glass skyscrapers of his companies, Juan's true empire was his home. There, he was not the feared business magnate, but simply Sophia's husband and Luna's father. His life, meticulously constructed, revolved around them. The mornings were filled with the aroma of coffee. He prepared himself for Sophia and Luna's laughter as they ran through the garden. He was a man who, despite his wealth, found his greatest treasure in the simplest moments, reading a story to his daughter before bed or sharing a glass of wine with his wife at the end of a long day. This dedication to his family was his driving force, the compass that guided all his decisions and kept him grounded, a constant reminder of what truly mattered in a world of ambition and power. The Garcia mansion, nestled in the hills of Guadalajara, was more than a display of wealth. It was a sanctuary. Designed by Juan himself, its glass walls opened onto lush gardens, creating a perfect fusion between modern architecture and nature. Every piece of art, every piece of furniture told a story, a memory of travels and happy moments. It was a world of light, transparency, and beauty, a reflection of the life Juan believed he had solidified. The pool glistened under the sun, reflecting the blue sky, an oasis of tranquility that isolated his family from the growing hostility of the city. This was his castle, the fortress built to protect his loves from the darkness he knew existed, but which he naively believed would never dare to cross his gates. However, the Jalisco of that decade was a land of brutal contrasts, where prosperity danced dangerously with violence. The power of the cartels infiltrated every sphere of society like a silent plague, from the government to the police. News of kidnappings and score settlings was a constant background noise, a dark melody that the elite tried to ignore at their lavish parties and charity events. Juan, aware of the dangers, invested heavily in security, convinced that his walls, both physical and financial, were impenetrable. He navigated this world with a calculated confidence, believing that his influence and his neutral stance would keep him and his family untouchable. The fragile peace he enjoyed was an illusion about to be shattered. The memory that would haunt him forever would be that of the Last Supper. The evening light flooded the dining room, painting the scene in golden and orange hues. Sophia, his wife, smiled at him from across the table, a smile that had always been his safe harbor. Luna, with her 7 years of pure energy, excitedly recounted her day at school, gesturing with her small hands as she described a drawing she had made. The sound of their laughter filled the space, a symphony of happiness and love. That night, Juan felt like the luckiest man in the world. He watched his two queens, his heart overflowing with a contentment so deep it was almost painful. It was a perfect moment, a living photograph of everything he had fought for, an instant of peace that preceded the devastating storm. The essence of Juan lay in his belief in control. He was an architect, not only of buildings and logistical systems, but of his own destiny. His journey from poverty to opulence reinforced the idea that the universe was a logical system, where effort and intelligence yielded predictable results. He saw success not as a passport to excess, but as the ultimate tool to ensure the safety and well-being of his family. Protecting Sophia and Luna was his primary mission, the purpose that gave meaning to every acquisition, every closed deal. This conviction in his own ability to shape reality and protect his own blinded him to the chaotic and brutal truth that some forces cannot be controlled, negotiated, or overcome by logic. Despite his status, Juan was always an outsider. In the high society salons of Guadalajara, he was an object of curiosity and veiled resentment. The traditional elite, with their ancient surnames and inherited fortunes, saw him as new money, an intruder in their exclusive club. His skin color and humble origins were whispered about in corners, even as they shook his hand and praised his achievements. Juan felt this exclusion, this hypocrisy, but he ignored it, focusing on his own goals. This position of isolation, however, would later prove crucial. He had no true allies among the powerful, no one to turn to when the system turned its back on him. He was, and always had been, fundamentally, alone in his ivory tower. That fateful night, after putting Luna to bed, Juan found Sophia on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. The air was calm, scented with jasmine from the garden. They talked about the future, about a trip to Europe they were planning, about the dreams they still had for their daughter. He held her, feeling the warmth of her body, inhaling her scent, unknowingly engraving that moment into his soul. "We've built a good life, my love," she whispered, and he agreed, feeling a wave of gratitude and peace. It was the last time he felt peace. It was the last moment of silence before his world was swallowed by an unending scream, an echo of pain that would redefine his existence and transform him from a builder of empires into an angel of death. The sound that broke the silence of that dawn was not an alarm or a siren, but the shrill ring of the telephone beside his bed. The voice on the other end was cold, devoid of any emotion, a metallic tone that spoke of business, but the product was the life of his family. The words were simple, direct, and brutal. Sophia and Luna were with them. The ransom was an astronomical figure, an amount that would test the limits of his empire. But the condition was absolute, no police. Each syllable was a hammer blow to Juan's chest, shattering the glass dome he had built around his life. Control, certainty, order. It all disintegrated in an instant, replaced by an icy panic that shot up his spine, a primal terror he had never imagined he could feel. Acting with the automatism of a man in shock, Juan plunged into the darkness of this new reality. His brain, accustomed to calculating risks and profits, now operated in a single mode: survival. He activated his network of contacts, not to close deals, but to liquidate assets in a matter of hours, turning stocks and properties into stacks of cash. Every call was an exercise in self-control, his firm voice masking the torrent of despair that was drowning him inside. He moved through his empty mansion like a ghost, the silence now oppressive, every echo a torturous reminder of their absence. The empire he built to protect them would now be the instrument to buy them back, and he would bleed every penny without hesitation, for the world without them no longer had any value. The drop-off location was a horror movie cliché, an abandoned industrial complex in the forgotten outskirts of Jalisco, a skeleton of concrete and rust under a starless sky. Juan drove alone, the car filled with bags of money, each kilometer increasing the pressure in his chest. The atmosphere was thick, the air heavy with the smell of mold and decay, a grim omen of what was to come. He followed the instructions with robotic precision, left the bags at the designated spot, and retreated, his heart hammering against his ribs. The wait that followed was the longest of his life. Minutes stretched into an eternity in the deafening silence, a void where hope and dread waged a mortal battle in his soul. Hope died at dawn on the third day. There was no phone call, no further demand. The news came in the form of distant approaching sirens, an ominous sound that guided him to a vacant lot. The scene was a nightmare, recorded on yellow police tape. The casual disregard of the officers, the impersonal glare of camera flashes, and, at the center of it all, two shapes covered by white sheets. The moment an officer lifted a corner of the fabric, Juan's universe imploded. There was no scream, no tears, just an absolute silence, a cosmic vacuum that swallowed him whole. The man who was Juan García, the husband, the father, the magnate, died there, next to the bodies of his wife and daughter, leaving behind only an empty shell, filled with an infinite nothingness. At the police station, the smell of stale coffee and indifference filled the air. The detective, a man with a tired gaze and a nicotine-stained mustache, recited the conclusion with bureaucratic monotony. A kidnapping gone wrong. The case would be filed away. It was in that instant, under the fluorescent light humming above his head, that Juan's grief crystallized. Morning transformed into a cold, cutting clarity. The system hadn't failed. It was complicit. The law hadn't protected him. It served the monsters. There, in the abyss of his loss, a silent decision was forged in the depths of his soul. If there was no justice in the world of men, he would become justice itself. It was no longer a matter of grief, but of purpose. He would hunt every last one of them, not for revenge, but as an act of cosmic rebalancing. Juan García orchestrated his social death with the same precision with which he built his empire. He liquidated his public assets, transferred control of his companies to an anonymous board, and, to the world, simply vanished. The newspapers and news channels reveled in the mystery, speculating about a mental breakdown, an escape to a deserted island, or a quiet suicide. The magnate who once dominated business headlines was now a tragic footnote. This narrative of the broken, reclusive billionaire was his greatest weapon, a perfect smokescreen that allowed him to operate in the shadows. While the world mourned or forgot the name Juan García, a new being, forged in pain and purpose, began to take shape in the darkness of his self-imposed solitude. The opulent mansion, once a sanctuary of love, transformed into a mausoleum, and beneath it an arsenal. Secretly, for years, Juan had built a bunker, a technological safe haven that now became his nerve center. Walls lined with monitors displayed a constant stream of data. Surveillance feeds from across the city, access to encrypted networks, strategic maps. In one corner, an arsenal of state-of-the-art weapons lay clean and orderly. In another, forensic equipment that could rival the police lab. There, Juan's genius for logistics and technology was repurposed for a single objective: war. The bunker was the physical manifestation of his transformation, a brain of concrete and fiber optics, pulsing with a cold desire for vengeance. His metamorphosis was brutal and absolute. The days were filled with a merciless physical training regimen, every muscle pushed to the point of exhaustion. The physical pain, a welcome balm for the agony corroding his soul. He became a living weapon, his body sculpted from steel and fury. The nights were dedicated to study. He devoured military tactics manuals, criminology treatises, forensic guides, and behavioral psychology. He wasn't just preparing to fight. He was becoming a predator, learning to think, hunt, and kill like the monsters he swore to exterminate. The reflection in the mirror no longer showed the sophisticated businessman, but a stranger with empty eyes and a terrifying determination. Juan García was being systematically erased, making way for the Justiciero. It was Mateo who found him first, his former head of security, and the only man Juan implicitly trusted. A decorated ex-military man, Mateo had stepped away from active service, disillusioned with the corruption he saw eating away at the institutions from within. Upon finding Juan in his sanctuary of pain and planning, his initial shock gave way to a grim understanding. He saw in his former employer's eyes the same flame of despair he felt towards the system. Loyalty to Juan, coupled with his own code of honor, which had been broken by reality, led him to make a decision. He would not be a mere accomplice. He would be the strategist, the right-hand man, and perhaps the last anchor preventing Juan from drowning completely in the darkness of his own mission. The first name on the list was insignificant, a mere pawn on the cartel's vast chessboard, one of the sicarios who participated in the kidnapping. To the world, he was a ghost, but to Juan, with his nearly limitless resources, he was an open book. Using facial recognition software and hacking into government databases, Juan tracked his movements, his habits, his weaknesses. The hunt was methodical, patient, and devoid of any emotion. He watched him for weeks, learning every detail of his pathetic life. There was no rush, only the cold certainty of a predator cornering its prey. This first step wasn't about impulsive anger. It was a test, a proof of concept for the war to come, and he would execute it with the perfection of a business plan. The confrontation occurred in a fetid alley, drenched by the rain that seemed to wash the city of its sins. It was the Justiciero's baptism by fire. For an instant, as he faced the murderer of his family, Juan hesitated. A flash of memory, Sophia's smile, Luna's laugh, paralyzed him. But that hesitation lasted only a second before it transformed into a wave of icy fury that solidified his resolve. The violence that followed was brutal and efficient. Before the final blow, he extracted information, using pain and fear as keys to unlock the cartel's secrets. The act was raw, visceral, and it marked him forever. That night, as the rain mixed with blood, the whispers began in the underworld. A new shadow had arrived in Jalisco, the Justiciero Negro. With the information obtained, Juan began to climb the cartel's hierarchical ladder. His approach was surgical. Each elimination was a message, a symbolic act that sowed panic and paranoia in the enemy ranks. He left no fingerprints or shell casings. Instead, he left a symbol, an enigmatic mark that the police didn't understand, but which terrified the criminals. His violence was calculated, almost artistic in its precision. He became a myth, a ghost who hunted the hunters, a force of nature that could not be bought, intimidated, or stopped. The Justiciero wasn't just killing his targets, he was dismantling the very power structure of the cartel, one link at a time, with terrifying efficiency. The bodies began to pile up, all linked to the Jalisco cartel, all executed, with a precision that defied the logic of gang violence. The case was handed to Detective Sofia Vargas, one of the few incorruptible figures in the police department. Obstinate and incredibly perceptive, she quickly dismissed the theory of a turf war. There was an intelligence, a methodology behind the deaths that haunted her. She saw a pattern where her colleagues saw only chaos, the signature of a single executor, a brilliant mind driven by an unknown agenda. Unknowingly, she became the official hunter of the shadow Juan had become, a woman of the law pursuing a ghost born from the failure of the law itself. While his physical presence sowed terror in the streets, his digital presence wreaked havoc on the cartel's systems. Juan, the technology genius, transformed into a cyber ghost. He hacked their bank accounts, diverting funds and exposing money laundering. He planted disinformation in their communication networks, creating distrust and inciting internal conflicts that led to bloody purges. He turned the cartel's greatest strength, its organization and discipline, into its greatest weakness. Juan's war was not fought with guns alone, but with algorithms and lines of code. He was corroding the empire from the inside out, making the monster devour itself without it knowing which hand was feeding it poison. In the poorest neighborhoods of Guadalajara, where the cartel reigned and the police rarely dared to enter, a strange urban legend began to flourish. The Justiciero, Negro, became a whisper of hope in the darkness. For the people who lived under the yoke of violence and extortion, he was not a murderer, but an avenging angel. Graffiti of his shadowy symbol began to appear on walls. a silent act of rebellion and support. This popular veneration created an unexpected problem for Detective Vargas. How could she hunt a monster who for half the city was the only hero they had? The line between right and wrong grew increasingly blurry in the fog of fear and admiration that surrounded the vigilante. The wave of chaos finally reached the top. El Señor de los Silencios, the enigmatic leader of the cartel, a man who moved with equal ease in high society salons and torture basements, realized the threat was different. It wasn't the police nor a rival cartel. It was something new, precise and personal. Publicly an entrepreneur and benefactor, in the shadows, he was a sadistic strategist. With a terrifying calm, he mobilized his vast resources, not just his sicarios, but his contacts in politics and the police, to hunt the ghost that haunted his empire. The asymmetrical hunt had become a duel between two kings operating on opposing boards, a deadly game of anticipation and cruelty. As Juan delved deeper into his crusade, Mateo watched with growing concern. The mission, which had begun as an act of justice, was spiraling into ever more brutal violence. Juan was becoming colder, more distant, the light in his eyes being replaced by a frigid emptiness. Mateo, the pragmatic ex-soldier, now found himself in the role of a reluctant conscience. "Is this still for Sofia and Luna?" he asked one night in the silence of the bunker. "Or is it just for you now?" The tension between them grew, a constant reminder that the war against monsters came at a cost, the humanity of the one waging it. Juan's internal fracture manifested itself on a rainy night. After a particularly savage operation, he returned to the bunker, another man's blood on his hands. He saw his reflection in one of the surveillance monitors that had cracked during a fit of rage weeks earlier. The fractured glass distorted his image, splitting his face into disconnected fragments. In that instant, he didn't recognize himself. He saw only a stranger, a predator with haunted eyes, a creature of the night. The image shook him deeply, a visual metaphor for his broken soul. The man he had been, the loving husband and father, was lost forever, replaced by that mosaic of pain and violence. The price of the path I've chosen may be too high, but turning back is no longer an option, and I hope that you who follow me understand that. Detective Vargas was relentless. Using her intuition and a meticulous analysis of the crime scenes, she began to predict the Justiciero's movements. She set a trap, a perfect bait that Juan, in his focused arrogance, almost missed. The ensuing operation was a near disaster. Juan and Mateo were forced into a desperate escape across the rooftops of Guadalajara, with police bullets whizzing far too close. The encounter served as a brutal wake-up call. Vargas was not like the other corrupt or incompetent cops. She was a real threat, intelligent and determined. Juan realized he was fighting a war on two fronts, hunted by both criminals and the only honest representative of the law he despised. Meanwhile, investigative journalist Elena Rios began publishing a series of articles that shook the power structures in Jalisco. Fearless and tireless, she started connecting the Justiciero's victims to a pattern of corruption that reached the highest echelons of politics and business. Her reports, though not mentioning the vigilante, painted a picture of a rotten system, giving context to the murders that terrorized the elite. Unknowingly, she became Juan's most powerful ally. Her words were as devastating as his bullets, and together, though unknown to each other, they were attacking the two heads of the same dragon, crime and the corruption that protected it. Recognizing the power of the press, Juan saw Elena as a tool to achieve his ultimate goal. It wasn't enough to kill the guilty. He had to destroy the system that created them. Through an anonymous, encrypted communication channel, he began to leak documents, recordings, and evidence he obtained in his raids. They were breadcrumbs that guided the journalist along the path of truth. It was a dangerous game that put him at risk of exposure, but he knew that true. Victory would not come from the barrel of a gun, but from the revelation of the truth. He needed to destroy the reputation and facade of legitimacy of El Señor de los Silencios for his empire to crumble publicly. El Señor de los Silencios, a master of manipulation, realized the attack was not just physical, but also informational. He felt the net closing in around his carefully constructed reputation. In response, he devised his own trap. Using a high-level politician as bait, he leaked false information to Elena Rios, a fabricated story that promised to be the scoop of her career. His goal was twofold: to discredit the journalist and, more importantly, to use her investigation to lure the Justiciero onto terrain where he would have the advantage. The chessboard was becoming more complex, with pawns and queens being moved in a deadly dance of disinformation and violence. Detective Vargas, following her own line of investigation, finally found the missing piece. In a dusty, forgotten, cold case file, she found the report on the kidnapping and murder of Juan Garcia's family. The investigation had been cursory, hastily closed, and full of inconsistencies. When she cross-referenced the dates and targets of the Justiciero with the names vaguely mentioned in the report, everything clicked. The Vigilante's identity and motivation became painfully clear. The revelation plunged her into a deep moral crisis. Her duty was to arrest a murderer, but her instinct told her she was hunting a victim who was seeking the only justice left to him. Juan's war took its most personal toll during a raid on one of the cartel's labs. The operation went wrong, and amidst the chaos of gunfire and explosions, Mateo threw himself in front of Juan, shielding him from a spray of bullets. Seeing him fall, bleeding on the dirty floor, was a shock that pierced through Juan's haze of rage. He managed to extract Mateo, but the image of his only friend, his only link to the past, nearly dying for his cause, haunted him. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than grief and fury, the fear of losing the only person he had left. The crusade was no longer just his. He had dragged others into his personal hell. The conflict evolved beyond the physical, becoming a psychological battle fought in the shadows of Guadalajara. Juan used his executions to send direct messages to El Señor, leaving crime scenes that symbolically recreated the cartel's own crimes. In response, El Señor used the media, giving interviews as the benevolent businessman, but embedding veiled messages and threats in his words that only Juan would understand. It was a dialogue of death and symbolism, a duel of intellects waged through intermediaries and newspaper headlines. Each tried to break the other psychologically, to anticipate their next move, in a macabre dance that consumed the city. After months of hunting, hacking systems, and interrogating targets, Juan finally discovered the cornerstone of El Señor's empire. It was not a vault full of money or drugs, but something far more valuable, a digital ledger. This file contained a meticulous record of every bribe, every piece of blackmail, every political favor that kept the cartel untouchable. It was the proof that connected judges, police chiefs, and politicians directly to El Señor. Destroying the man was not enough. To ensure that no other monster took his place, Juan needed that ledger. It became his obsession, the key not only to vengeance, but to the destruction of the entire corrupt ecosystem. The final prize was kept in the most secure location in Jalisco, El Señor's penthouse, a skyscraper of glass and steel transformed into an impenetrable fortress. State-of-the-art security systems, armed guards on every floor, and the bought loyalty of the local police made a direct assault a suicide mission. Juan realized that brute force would be useless. He would need a plan that was more of a precision heist than a battle, an operation that would require the full use of his intellect, his technological skills, and his ability to manipulate the environment to his advantage. He would have to enter the heart of the lion's den without the lion knowing he was there. Sofia Vargas, now convinced of the Justiciero's identity, knew where he would go: The pattern of escalation, the logic of his hunt, everything pointed to a final confrontation with the cartel boss. She didn't mobilize her task force to arrest him. Instead, she acted alone, driven by a need to understand, perhaps even to intervene in a way that didn't involve handcuffs. Using her knowledge of Juan's past, his psychology, she tried to anticipate his moves, not to stop him, but to confront him before he crossed a threshold from which he might never return. The collision between the law and personal justice was becoming imminent. With his final plan laid out, Juan sent one last encrypted message to Elena Rios. It contained no leaks or evidence, only an instruction and a time coordinate. Be ready to publish. The world needs to see. He was setting the stage not just for the battle, but for its aftermath. His goal was not simply to kill El Señor in the dark, it was to drag him into the light, expose every one of his accomplices, and ensure that the fall of his empire was broadcast live for the entire nation to see. Juan's revenge would only be complete when the truth was his most